When it comes to watering, a lot of people ask, how much should I be watering and when should I be watering? So in today's episode, I'm gonna break down how you know when you should be watering and how much to water. Let's go. So the first thing to know are the crops that you're growing. Certain crops like more water than others. In the case of these brassica crops here, we have some broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, kale. They like it to be far more damp than, say, rosemary. And so if you're growing a crop that likes more water, that's obviously going to mean you're going to be watering more frequently. And so knowing those crops is going to help you to understand just how much you should be watering. And then once you actually can dial that in, then it comes down to some finer nuance like your soil type, your pot size, the environment, and other things we'll talk about. Now, the first thing to understand is the type of crops you're growing. When it comes to watering, there's a big difference between brassicas and a really arid, dry-loving crop like this rosemary. When it comes to brassicas, you're gonna be watering them far more frequently than you will this rosemary. And so understanding that will help you to understand just how much you should be watering, because if it's a crop that likes it dry, you shouldn't be watering it that frequently. And if it's a crop that likes it wet, well, if it looks dry, you probably should be watering it. So understanding that and dialing that in is the first step. If you get that wrong, well, then nothing else matters. After that, once you hone that in, then it comes down to some of the other things we're going to talk about, like pot size, soil type, and even environmental conditions. The next thing that dictates how often you're going to be watering is the cell size. Now, when it comes to the cell size, it makes a huge difference because the smaller the cell, the less soil's in it. And as we talked about before, the soil is the only thing holding on to that water. It's the medium that the plant is growing in. And so the more soil you have, the longer it's going to take for that soil to dry out. Now, this here is a 3-inch pot. We'll water this about every 3 to 4 days. This here is a 6-cell pack, and this only holds, comparatively, probably like 7 times less soil than a 3-inch pot. So we're gonna be watering this about every 2 days, pretty frequently. Compare that to this 200-cell tray here with this thyme. Thyme is an arid-loving crop, so it does tend to like it a little drier, but even then, these cells here are really, really small. And these cells, we'll probably have to water these almost every day. So despite the fact that it loves to be kept dry, still doesn't negate the fact that they do need some water. And so the cell size makes a huge difference. So the next thing we're gonna look at is if it's freshly seeded versus a seedling. Now, a freshly seeded seed is gonna need far more moisture, far more frequently than a seedling will. And that's because seeds require consistent, constant moisture. Otherwise, once they dry out, the germination rate can really fail or be dramatically decreased. Once the seeds sprout, it doesn't matter what it is. It could be like this thyme here, or it could even be an onion, a tomato, a broccoli, a cabbage. It really doesn't matter what it is. It's going to need far less water than the seed version. So once it sprouts, you're gonna find that you're gonna dial that water back pretty dramatically because it's not going to require as much water. If you were to water as frequently a seedling as you do a seed, you'll find that you'll suffer from things like damping off or root rot pretty frequently. And that's a big thing a lot of gardeners face, is they try to treat all their plants the same and all stages of that plant the same. And because of that, they find that they overwater. And that's a really simple thing to fix. Now, the next thing that dictates how often you're going to be watering has to do with your trays. Now, if your trays are holeless, you're going to be practicing what's called bottom watering. And that's where you water your seedlings from just simply putting water in the tray and allowing the plants to wick that moisture up through the pot. If your trays have holes, you're gonna be top watering, and all that water is coming through your pot. Now, there's a benefit to using both, and I will use both depending on what I'm growing and the stage of life that that plant is in. I find that it's far easier to bottom water a freshly seeded plant, so like the seed version, than it is to bottom water a seedling. And that's because seedlings require a lot more water all at once, but then they can be let to go dry for 1 or 2 days while that plant is kind of getting acclimated before you have to water again. And so if you have water sitting in a tray like this, it's obviously not going to be ideal, and you're going to suffer from a lot of things like damping off and root rot, as well as mold and fungus. Whereas if your water simply goes through the bottom of the tray, like in the case of this holed seed tray here, this holed seed tray is going to be great for growing seedlings because they don't need that excess water, and any excess water is going to drain through those holes. So I will use both depending on the time of life that plant is in. The other time I'm gonna use a holeless seed tray is if I'm indoors, right? So I don't want water to be running all over the ground, so I'm gonna wanna contain that water so my wife doesn't kill me. But that is another time when I would use a holeless seed tray regardless, but I'm gonna have to be far more careful to regulate how much I'm watering. And often what I'll have to do is pick my plants up, make sure there's not a bunch of excess water. If there is, I'll dump that excess water out so that they're not sitting in water for too long. So kind of just depends on the circumstances, but it definitely matters because you're gonna be watering a lot more frequently with a holed seed tray than you will a holeless, because that excess water does really help to reduce how fast they dry out. Now, the next thing that's gonna affect how often you're gonna have to water is the environment. Out here in the greenhouse, we're gonna be watering far more frequently than we are in our grow room. And the reason why is because the sun is so much stronger. Anytime you have heat, sunlight, or wind, those are conditions that are gonna help to cause evaporation. And because indoors, a lot of those conditions are either controlled or completely removed, you're gonna have kind of a case where you're gonna be watering far less frequently indoors than you are outdoors. A prime example too, if we were to have this greenhouse completely removed, we're gonna have even more wind. And so you're gonna have more wind, more airflow, that's gonna dry things out even faster. And so even though we're outside in a controlled environment like a greenhouse. Take away those conditions, we would have to water even more frequently. And so indoors, you take a plant, I'm gonna use this thyme as another example here. Indoors, we're gonna be watering this about every 2 to 3 days in these cells here. Outdoors, we're gonna water these almost every day, but if these were outside, open to the air and the sun and all the heat that's provided, we may even have to water these maybe up to 2 times per day. Again, depending on the circumstances. It really does come down to kind of gardener's intuition, I call it, where it may not need water, but on average, we're gonna be watering probably twice as much as we would in a greenhouse had these just been right outside. And so you add all those environmental conditions up, heat, humidity, right? The more humid it is, the less you're gonna be watering. The drier it is, the more you're gonna have to water. How hot it is, the hotter it is, the more evaporation is gonna happen. Sunlight, the more sun there is, the more you're gonna have to water. A fan, right? Airflow, the more airflow you have, the more you're gonna water. The less airflow you have, the less you're gonna have to water. Those are all conditions, environmental conditions, that you have to take into account to tell you how much you should be watering. All right, and the final thing that's going to dictate how often you're gonna be watering has to do with your soil. Now, I know you were probably thinking this the whole video, you're probably thinking, when is he gonna talk about soil? It's probably the most obvious thing that has to do with how often I'm gonna be watering, and he hasn't talked about it yet. Well, I usually save the most obvious for last because you probably already knew this. But if you didn't, now you're gonna know. Your soil has so much to do with how often you're gonna be watering because depending on a few different variables is going to dictate if you're gonna water a lot or very little. The first thing that you're gonna have to ask yourself is how much additives like vermiculite are in your soil. If you're using an out-of-the-box seed starting mix or a potting mix, generally there's gonna be about 15% by volume of vermiculite. But if you're making your own mix and you have a higher percentage, or maybe none at all, that's really gonna decide how often you're gonna be watering, because vermiculite is a soil additive that is made from an expanded volcanic rock, and it can hold up to 3 times its weight in water. So the more of it you have, the less you're gonna wanna be watering. Next soil additive that's usually in a potting mix or a seed starting mix is the main medium, and that can be either compost, which it rarely is if it's a seed starting mix, but it does exist out there. Something like a forest humus, compost, or peat moss, or coco coir. Now, coco coir is a byproduct of the coconut industry. It's the husk that's been shredded up, and it's really porous. It holds on to a lot of water. And the overall porosity of your soil dictates how much water, porous, think sponge, how spongy your soil is. The more spongy it is, the less you're gonna be watering because it's gonna hold on to a lot more water. Our soil here is a combination of a peat moss based mix and a coco coir based mix. It's about 50-50. So what it's gonna do is it's gonna hold on to water pretty well, but it is gonna provide some drainage capabilities. So knowing how well those soils hold on to water is going to really help you out. And the final thing to note about soil is how much perlite is added. And that has to do with the permeability of your soil. If your soil is very permeable, that has to do with how much the water can penetrate and run through your soil. If your water is very permeable, you're gonna be watering a lot. You're gonna be watering very frequently. Think sand. Sand is extremely permeable. You take a bucket of sand, you pour water in it, it's gonna flow through the bottom very fast. But you take, a bucket of sponges and pour water on that, it's gonna hold on to water really well. And so one thing that can affect permeability is perlite. Now, perlite is another expanded volcanic rock, but it's not porous. It doesn't hold on to water. It just basically helps with drainage. And so if you were to water this mix, you know, you're gonna water this mix and it's gonna hold on to some water, but any excess water should be able to drain through. And when you're deciding how often you should be watering, has to do with a combination of all three of those things. If you have too much vermiculite, you're gonna hold on to too much water. If you have too much perlite, it's gonna be draining too frequently. And so it's all about kind of the Goldilocks scenario and finding the right mix. For a beginner, you might just wanna buy a really good potting mix and call it good. Off the shelf, they're all gonna be about the same, and you're gonna have good luck with most of them. If you're making your own, I would really recommend watching some of our other videos on how to make your own potting mix or seed starting mix so you don't get those ratios wrong, because the ratios do make a huge difference. And like I said, finally, just understanding how different growing mediums will affect not only porosity, but also permeability in your soil, so you're not making those mistakes. And with that, that's everything you need to know about how often you should be watering and when you should be watering and how much you should be watering. All right, now I know you're probably thinking to yourself, well, Luke didn't really give me any hard numbers to go off of, right? Is it 3 times a week? Is it 1 gallon? How often? How much? The reason why I didn't give you those hard numbers is because it's gonna be different for all of us. Your soil is gonna be different than mine. Your growing conditions will be different than mine. And so what takes you 2 to 3 times a week may only take me once a week. And that is why I cannot give you hard numbers. Otherwise, I'm gonna be leading you astray. So if you're someone that likes to be fed with a silver spoon, all that information, that's not gonna be in this video. You are gonna have to use a little bit of what I call gardener's intuition to help you out. But this video is hopefully gonna be an awesome roadmap to get you to success. So I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you all learned something new. If you have any other questions or concerns, please leave them in the comments box down below. I'll happily help you out. And as always, this is Luke from the MIgardener channel, reminding you to grow bigger. Take care.